Day. I am a professor here at the University of Washington in the Department of Linguistics. I also manage the minor program. I've been here 13 years. And I would like to thank the Asian Language Department for hosting this event today. Very exciting. This is a unique event. The ALL program, along with the University of Washington campus, having exposure to languages and cultures that are unique, that focus on sign language, cultural experience, and linguistics, oppression. Autism is a word maybe many are not familiar with, and that is any academic institution that does not really include the culture and language of deaf people. So we have many majors across campus, different departments, and having deaf culture be central and a focus of those departments and majors is important. As well, having it represented in a foreign language department or focus and research. There are deaf people in the US, but as well all over the globe. 70 million people use sign language. They are deaf and hard of hearing, as well as children of deaf adults, people who have grown up in deaf families called codas, interpreters, students of sign language. And the numbers continue to rise globally. And research is not often featured. So to see this type of diversity, inclusion represented here at the University of Washington, I hope it will lead to further research and more language colloquiums classes showing up across campus. It opens the door to the possibilities of the future. I myself love Asian cultures. I have several friends who live across Asia. I've been to other countries in the region of Asian countries, Korea, South Korea. And when I was visiting South Korea, a friend introduced me to Dr. Hwang. He was actually living in the US. He'd been here for 25 years and was there in South Korea. And I happened to meet him there and learned about his research around Korean Sign Language and Bible translations and the gamut of things that he was working on at the time. And I felt like that was something we needed to feature here. So we were lucky enough to be able to bring him to the University of Washington to provide this colloquium today. And I'm honored to introduce Dr. Hwang Chang. My role today, I'm acting as the moderator. So I will make sure that translation occurs adequately. Dr. Hwang will use ASL, American Sign Language, and you're going to hear a voice interpreter, an English translation of that sign. And he's signing about Korean Sign Language. So he may model some of that and go back and forth between the two sign languages. And there is also written Korean slides that you will see. So it's written language. And we will talk about some of the effects. He will talk about some of the effects on KSL. So it's pretty complicated to merge all of those languages into one presentation. And I will be moderating that to make sure it all goes smoothly. If you have questions, we will have a question and answer period. And there's a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you need clarification, you can go ahead and type it in there. If there are questions you want to present to Dr. Hwang, if you could hold them till the end, and then I'll moderate that question and answer period. So we're looking forward to this presentation. I am thrilled to invite Dr. Hwang to take over from here.
Hello, my name is Chang Hwang. First, I'd like to introduce a little bit about where I'm from. I am from South Korea. I initially came to America with the intention of studying at Gallaudet University, and that is particularly because there have been a lot of problems with education as a whole, and I wanted to make sure to come to America for that opportunity. Now, keep in mind that the American education system, the availability of education for deaf in America is excellent. So my anticipation was that I would come for education here, return to South Korea and teach there. But unfortunately, that's not how it worked out, and I have stayed as a result. Now, in 1997, I went to Liberty for their master's program, and that was where I ended up graduating from. And that was in the Maryland area over by Washington, D.C., the general Maryland area. There was a deaf church that was founded. And I worked as a part of that church, worked in that service for 25 years. Now, when I had attended Liberty University, I found myself very surprised. Now, I did travel in the general DMV area. So when I was traveling around Maryland, you know, I might have to make a trip that was 4 hours there and back occasionally, which was quite boring. But I did have a hearing friend who was a neighbor, and they were an interpreter, and so they would drive with me sometimes. We talked about, you know, being sleepy while making such a lengthy drive. A hearing person, they can make a lengthy drive. They have something to listen to. They have their radio. Not so for me. So while that neighbor would ride in the car with me, they would occasionally tap me and say, "Hey, you're looking a little tired," and make sure that I uh, made it through the 4-hour drive. And it's not easy to spend a solid 4 hours driving without anything to listen to. So often I would stop for something like coffee at 7-Eleven. And I remember that hearing friend talk about that, saying, "Well, how is it that you're so capable of making such a long, monotonous drive?" And that's when we brought up the topic of, you know, having church music, perhaps a CD that you can listen to and listen to the worship songs while driving, and that's the kind of thing that might keep you up. That's what they told me their strategy was. And it felt very unfair that I had no such strategy for myself. And that thought started to occur to me that hearing people, they have the ability to record information, access that information whilst doing other activities in a way that deaf people don't. Right? Deaf people take in their information visually. They use their eyes to do that. So the equivalent for them is not something like the radio, is not a CD, but is instead a DVD or a video, something that provides that information on a screen. So it's, again, emphasizing that as deaf people, we are visual people. We collect information through our eyes. That's how we take in the information that's around us. So our eyes are very important to us. And having had that conversation was really a wake-up moment for me. I started to analyze and think about different information, parts of language, particularly things like the Bible, different translations of the Bible. If you consider Bible translations, you go back to the early Bibles when translations happened. They were trying to also do translations here in America over time. Australia has also attempted to do translations into sign language for Bible translations. Meanwhile, a sign language translation equivalent for South Korea does not or did not exist. And I think that the value of a Bible translation in South Korean Sign Language is important. And that led to the greater question of the language as a whole, research, information that is available regarding Korean Sign Language. So I did make a trip to Wycliffe Bible Translation Institute in California, and that was in 1996. And while I was there, I asked them, I wanted to make sure, I asked them about their process for sign language Bible translation. And they said that a lot of their work didn't happen physically in their building, but also in Texas, also in Chicago. A lot of that American Sign Language Bible translation happened in other parts of the country. And as time went on, I continued to think about it, continued to remember the value of having a sign language translation of the Bible, as well as thinking about how that relates to my home country, South Korea. And I started thinking about all of the analysis that goes into a Bible translation, like the American Sign Language one that exists. Now, if we consider South Korea as a whole, and we want to consider how many deaf people live there, actually, I will get into that a little bit later. First, I'd like to give you a little context of geographically where South Korea is. So there's the larger zoomed out view that's quite small, and then the exploded view right here. There's North Korea, and then in yellow is South Korea. As a whole, and keep in mind I'm talking about South Korea only, not North Korea. Here is a graph that shows the approximate population. So about 51 million people live in South Korea. Now, if we were to estimate the number of deaf people, you might want to look at data from Ministry of Health and Welfare, which is what I have done. They have a report that I was able to find. Fortunately, it's in written Korean, so if you can't read it, unfortunately, but what it says right here, it's underlined down here, is 380,000. That's the number that they have listed in that report. And that report was back in December of 2019. So that is the age of that data. Another piece of data, this particular information is a TV program that sought to interview sign language interpreters. And so with that information, having asked sign language interpreters in the area, we approximate that it's about 390,000 deaf people. Now with that source, you also might wonder how many KSL interpreters there are, and they found there was 1,824 Korean Sign Language interpreters. The image below is a sign language interpreter himself. If you're curious about how many total users, it is estimated to be over 1 million. Now that number is so large because KSL users include people like just students who are taking classes and have taken classes, over the years. So that number grows every year as more people learn the language. So now I'd like to get into a little bit more of the history of Korean Sign Language. Now I'd like to preface this by saying that a lot of KSL history is unknown. It is filled with many questions. As far as books, information, resources, primary information, it can be incredibly difficult to find. A lot of the information I've been able to find has been online, but a lot of that information is very truncated and it's little bits at a time. There's little extensive information available online. But there are researchers that do still spend their time looking and finding more of those sources. I have aggregated the sources that I have, and I look forward to sharing that information with you today. Now, in 1909, keep in mind that is the part of South Korea pre-colonially. So at that time, during that period, many missionaries were coming over, doing various types of work in Korea. Keep in mind that at that time, education was not the best. Hospitals, healthcare needs were high. There were not enough. And so many of those missionaries came as medical missionaries. And many of them also came in an educational nature. So they came and founded schools, hospitals, etc. One particular group, the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, back in 1890, right? They were founded in America, or based out of America. And one particular woman, Dr. Rosetta Sherwood Hall. Dr. Hall, she arrived also, she was one of those medical missionaries. She was sent to Korea through the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, and that was in 1890. So that was during that time period that I mentioned. Now, while she was there, Dr. Hall, when she arrived in Korea, saw the living conditions that were there, particularly of the poor parts of the population. She saw disease, illness, and one particular thing that resonated with her was blind citizens. She met one girl who was blind who wanted to be educated, and she worked to educate her. And so in 1894, that led her to found the Pyongyang Girls Blind School as a result of her work with that girl. As she was teaching, she did actually fly to New York at one point to learn Braille. So having gone to New York, learned Braille there, brought it back to Korea, it occurred to her, and in 1898, she created the Korean Braille system to teach. That work continued as she then discovered that there were deaf people who needed to be educated as well. Just like she had the blind school, she wanted blind children to be able to be educated. She also realized that there was a need for deaf children. So she integrated that and it became Pyongyang School for the Deaf and Blind. And that happened in 1909. But when it comes to teaching and instructing a blind child, that's very different than instructing a deaf child. The strategies will be very different. So prior to that, in 1908, this is her, this is Dr. Hall. And I would like to mention that she is a wonderful woman. She has a special place in Korean history. So she is considered the mother of special education for Korea. So she is known, she does have that name, Mother of Korean Special Education. And she's done a lot to help blind students, deaf students, and generally further special education as a whole. In Pyongyang, if you are not familiar geographically, I'd like to provide you a little context. Pyongyang is a part of North Korea, and you can see South Korea below. At the time of the Japanese occupation, that was 1910. Prior to that, there was no North and South Korea. It was a unified Korea. And so again, a little bit of geographical context. That's where Pyongyang is. So that is where that school was originally founded by Dr. Hall. And you can see we have a primary source here. It's a photograph. And it is one indication, proof that they were using signed language at the time. This photograph shows that, and you can see it, it's quite small. So I've highlighted it with circles. This is the letter R. And it's not Korean, it's not Japanese, it's actually the American Sign Language hand shape for R. Here's D, and then here's G. So we have an indication there that the school founded by Dr. Hall was using some sign language via that photo. Now, Dr. Hall herself, she founded that deaf school. She was the first person to do so in Korea, but she needed a methodology on how to do it. So she reached out to another missionary, A.T. Mills, a friend of hers, and had A.T. Mills go to China. China had already had a deaf school established. Their deaf school was established in 1887. And so, having been founded, that was called the Gyum Deaf School, located in China. Because it had already been founded, that work had already been done, Dr. Hall decided she would stay in Korea, send her friend, fellow missionary, Ik-min Lee, over to China to visit Gyum School. So Ik-min Lee was dispatched to learn the methodology on how to educate deaf children. Ik-min Lee spent 1 year there before returning in 1909. And together with Dr. Hall, they were able to found that original deaf school in Pyongyang. So Pyongyang School for the Deaf and Blind is a result of that trip. The school was founded, instruction started to happen for deaf children, but there was still a problem. There was no strong Korean Sign Language. And while there was in China, they couldn't just use Chinese Sign Language. So they mostly defaulted to oral and oriented education, using oralist methods to provide education to children. So now you can see this red star here, that's Seoul. And there is a deaf school there that was also founded later. That deaf school was called Seng Wang, Department of Blind and Deaf. I will abbreviate it as JSW rather than finger spelling out Seng Wang every time. So Seng Wang, JSW, was founded in Seoul. 1910, though, was when the Japanese occupation had happened. So Japan was in control of Korea and in control of Seoul at the time. They had noticed that there were many plights of the people, including illness, disease, deaf and blind education. And so those students who suffered from or who experienced various things were brought to JSW and left. Whether that means that they were blind or they were deaf, whether JSW was prepared to educate them, they were brought there. So in 1913, that began the foundation of the deaf and blind school there.
They were teaching Japanese Sign Language. So they had brought Japanese teachers into the school at JSW. Those teachers were brought from Japan to provide education, and they would teach sign language. It wasn't an oral method at that point, so they were actually teaching sign. They weren't teaching Korean Sign Language, however, they were using Japanese Sign Language. So there's that impact as well. And there's not any written information about this. However, I believe the reason they were using Japanese Sign Language was to bring in Japanese methodologies, thinking, and Japanese way of life. So at JSW, it was first established in 1913, and the school ran until 2013. During that 100 years, there are a few publications that I have been able to look at, and I have been able to source a lot of information from those texts that I have found. In 1913, the first school was established. It was a residential school, and there were 11 students on record. By 1921, we have 46 deaf students in residence. And by 1927, it had gone up to 71. And you can see the picture here in front of the school. And as the school was a place for deaf and blind students, you can't really identify deaf students. They're in the mix there. But more and more deaf students were learning sign language. And this continued until 1945. There were over 245 Korean deaf students and 61 Japanese students. JSW was a deaf residential school, and students graduated from there. And I just mentioned Japanese students. Oftentimes people are surprised by that, thinking that it's only Korean students going to this school. But there were graduates who were from Japan, deaf students who had moved from Japan. When Japan took over South Korea, deaf students from Japan moved to South Korea. And many of them went to JSW. So you'll notice the numbers there, that there were 61 deaf students who were of Japanese descent. Some of the students didn't want to learn Japanese sign language. They may, in Korea, they may have gone on to Tokyo and went to school there. Other students may have come from Korea to Tokyo to learn, or from Tokyo to South Korea to attend this school. So they were teaching Japanese sign language as well as teaching oral methods. So learning how to listen and respond auditorily. JSW also had a dormitory. It was a residential school. So some of the students were able to commute to home if they lived close by, if their families were close by, but many of the students lived in the dorm, and that was a special opportunity because it allowed them to socialize using sign language and communicate directly with each other. In 1920s, there was an association that was established, 1920, the Korean Blind and Deaf Association. When students graduated from JSW, they lost that social network that they had in place, per se. So this association provided a transition for them out into the community. Maybe they were looking for employment, or they wanted further education. There were various community activities. This Blind and Deaf Association provided that opportunity and that access. I don't have a lot more detailed information than that about the association. In 1924, I know that there was a sign language class. I found research about that. And the newspaper here, you'll see, it's the Dong AILBO. You see it down there below in yellow print. And that newspaper, that printing, had information about sign language classes advertised therein. So if people wanted to take a sign language class, they could find information there. I was curious about the purpose for students taking sign language through this program. And I found that it could be that deaf families or families that had deaf students in them or family members wanted to learn more sign language so they could communicate. So they would come and take this class, or maybe a deaf person who had some rudimentary sign language but wanted to expand their understanding and knowledge of sign language. So this newspaper provided advertising and a way for people to find out about the class offering. In 1928, the class focused primarily on hearing students. And those students maybe had been affiliated in some way with JSW. Maybe they had a family member who was a student there or a child, but the family didn't know sign language. And so when the student would graduate and maybe go back home to their family, there wouldn't be a way for them to communicate. So parents would take the sign language, and we have record of 35 parents of deaf students taking the sign language, as well as 5 employees of JSW. And they would join that class, learn some sign. It didn't last very long. It looks like it continued for about 2 months. So that sign language class was established. It just shows another example about how the language was growing and spreading, not just to deaf people, but as well hearing people. In 1935, the Japanese Association, the Chosen branch, that association that was located in Japan came up with a sister organization in South Korea. And primarily their focus was really to indoctrinate the teachings of Japan, the language and culture of Japan. They had a shrine that you can see in the picture here, this shrine, and they would require everyone to pay homage at this shrine. It was a requirement. If you didn't do it, you could be killed, murdered. People lived in fear. And so they would pay homage to the shrine. Other militaristic ways were added to the culture after the Japanese took over. They really trained people, brainwashed them into following this method of being in the society. They were required to change their names from Korean names to Japanese names. There was forced name changes. And at the deaf residential school, you will see a lot of historical examples of that. They were required to wear military uniforms, dress in a certain way. You can see here. And there, as you can see as well, it's mostly male students who are wearing a uniform. And they had to be war ready. That was the thinking during that time. It was 1942 when this picture was taken. And this is a deaf residential school. So the clothing requirements were established then. In 1935 to 1945, Japanese control ran rampant. There was forced language use. They had to change their language to be more centered on a Japanese way of sharing language. And militarization, South Koreans were also brought over to the Japanese mainland in order to provide service. They were enslaved. In the US military, government, 1945 to 1948, during that 3-year period of Japanese occupation of South Korea. Japanese as a country, very militaristic at that time, took over larger and larger land areas. And at that point is when the US dropped the atomic bombs in Japan, here in Hiroshima, and then again in Nagasaki. And as you may know, those 2 atomic bombings killed many, many people. You see here 233,000, 167,000 dead, respectively. And as you may notice here in the red down below, 30,000, those were actually Koreans who were killed in those bombings. In Hiroshima and then in Nagasaki, you see that red value there below. Another 10,000 were killed. And Americans didn't know that. We were allies with the US, and they didn't realize that they were killing Korean citizens. But by that point, so many Koreans had been brought over to Japan, enslaved, and they were there, and the Americans didn't know when they bombed the country that they were actually killing Korean citizens as well. So 30,000 and another 10,000 respectively. So when Japan dropped those bombs, later on, the Emperor of Japan gave up and Korea was liberated, South Korea was liberated. That was on August 15th, 1945. That was a big day in our history. And that had been several years of Japanese occupation, of hardship, and liberation happened. You can see from the pictures here of that day. In North Korea, the Soviet Union, Russia, had been embattled with Japan when the country was divided after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended, and Japanese people left. In the northern area of Korea, people didn't really know necessarily that Russia had been embattled against Japan, but when Japan lost and they left, at that point, Russia took over the northern region of Korea. You can see it here with the 38th parallel. This area was taken over, the control of that region was taken over by Russia, sadly. And the US primarily focused in South Korea and provided a means for democracy. We had voting then. At the Deaf Residential School, JSW, when Japan left, and the teachers that were Japanese left, the students, some of them stayed. We have one, the principal here, Yoon Biek Wang. He was Korean, a hearing person. He stayed on. And they didn't want to continue with the nomenclature of calling it JSW. So they changed the name at that point to the National School for Blind and Deaf. They didn't want to have that affiliation with Japan, so the name was changed. And the students who had been learning Japanese Sign Language didn't really have any foundation in Korean Sign Language at that point. It wasn't something that they had learned. So Yoon was concerned about this.
So Mr. Yoon, Baekwon Yoon, making sure the interpreters are squared away. Okay. So again, they had been emphasized up to that point Japanese language, Japanese written language, Japanese sign language. But when liberation happened and the Japanese left, that left them knowing, how do we replace that? What do we do there? And that left them with the question of how to approach it. And they didn't want to necessarily copy what they had already done with Japanese, but they did want to use a similar model with Korean Sign Language. And that led to the advent of the Hangu fingerprinting. This was the original inception of that concept. And again, that was from Baekwon Yoon, which is a very smart idea. And this is the same system that is in use today. The exact same system, it looks identical. So if you were to look at this and compare it with modern sources, you would see that it looks the same. Keep in mind, however, that North Korea's finger spelling system is different. The reason for that being that 38th parallel. As that border was enforced, it was June 25th, 1950, right? We have the war in Korea, and the 38th parallel was drawn, separating North Korea from South Korea. The deaf citizens of North and South Korea had no way to interact for 70 years. So their signing, their spelling systems look incredibly different in how they've changed over those times. So back in 2015, at the Turkey World Federation of the Deaf event that was held, North Korea had a delegation sent, including interpreters, teachers, and South Korea also sent their own delegation. So there they met in Turkey, North Korean deaf citizens and South Korean deaf citizens. They embraced, they were happy to see one another, but found that they struggled to communicate, even in spelling. Even their spelling systems are different. And if you're curious, they're about 90% different when it comes to spelling, finger spelling. You can see down here under the consonants, the two black ones, the giok and the neon, those are the same. Every other one that you see here in red have diverged. They're totally different, which made communicating between those two groups difficult. You can see it in this video here. So as you can see, the first two were the same, but over time, everything else has become different. The first two, just the giok and the neon. Every other consonant, every other vowel is different, which made communicating between those two groups very difficult. North Korea does have some sign language books, and we have one here from 2005, a new publication. Prior to that, there really wasn't much in the way of publicized works for sign language. You can see there's two right here. The one on the left is one for learning the language. The one on the right is a dictionary. So there are two books that students could use at the time. And again, that was in 2005 when they were published. They were new. And so you can see that their sign language has grown, but it is still very difficult to communicate between the two languages, between the two countries. So the screenshot from that video, you can see it's so difficult to communicate. The person on the far left, this gentleman here, he's South Korean. And then we have a North Korean delegate. We also have a deaf person. So we have deaf people, we have a hearing interpreter here. The two of them, while both being deaf, cannot communicate and have enlisted the use of an interpreter. So if you're curious, there's about 70% difference, which is extremely high. That's quite a number, 70% difference between the two languages having diverged. If you compare the changes and differences in spoken language, it's quite less, but in the sign language, it's been very different. Keep in mind that North Korea, the ability to fly in, fly out, exchange ideas, has been locked down for many years due to the drawing of the 38th parallel. So when that happened, the ability for them to interact with fellows from other countries, other parts of the country, has been very difficult. And as such, it's hard to communicate. So if you want a little more detail on how spoken language is different, we've got North Korean, South Korea, North Korean spoken language, South Korean spoken language. There's about 38% difference, which I hadn't realized until aggregating this information. 38% difference, that is sizably less than the 70% difference that we see in sign language. So the deaf citizens of North and South Korea, you can't communicate with a 70% difference. You can't get by. And as North Korea has opened occasionally to allow people to come in, have discussions, conversations about sign language, and try to grow that, the need for that understanding has grown. So we've got the sign language booklet from 1963. That was the first booklet that was published. This is a momentous piece of history. This was the first booklet that was published, again, 1963 in Seoul. That was at the deaf school. And there are no pictures. You can see there's some words, some explanations. I'll give you an example here. So we've got Korean, it's written in Korean, it says kada. And then I've got the English here. So that word means go. But there's no picture to show what it is. So there's a paragraph explaining what your hands do to sign go. This is to go. So the whole paragraph describing the sign, but it's a small booklet, so they can only do it in so many words. You might be wondering why that booklet was created. South Korea at the time had people signing, but it wasn't well unified yet. It hadn't been standardized quite yet. So they felt that a booklet that would help standardize some signs would be beneficial. Again, no pictures until we get to 1979. The Young Nak Deaf Church booklet. Now, that is an incredibly large booklet called Young, and it's published by the church Young Nak Deaf Church, located in Seoul. The name of the booklet is Our Sign Language. So hearing people were involved in the creation of this booklet, and you might wonder why hearing people would want to create a sign language booklet. They were hoping to increase the deaf members of their congregation. As deaf members had joined, they realized that the deaf members were using sign language. And so they found someone, they enlisted someone with drawing skills to then depict the signs of some important words into that booklet. So this is also a very important booklet. 1982, the Korean government got involved and created a dictionary. Now, this is not a booklet, it is a large book. And compare that with the 1984 Korean Deaf Association book that had been published by them. So keep in mind that Korea had many deaf associations and continues to have many deaf associations. These are all different associations, and you can see how many. This is Association 1, Seoul Deaf Association. So, oh, there are 5 of the Seoul Deaf Associations. Busan Deaf Association. Let's see. So this is number 2. So there's 251 in total, 252 associations that this book was then disseminated to. And that was in 1984, and that kicked off a period of growth and learning for the Korean Sign Language that was very important. Now, in the 1980s in general, keep in mind that at that time, many books were being published. Books were being published at a very rapid rate. If you look at this time period, a lot of books had been published, and all the way up until 1990s, 1991, you know, deaf students in Korea, they had been noted that their writing skills were not up to par with their hearing peers. So the government allotted funding to help deaf schools in a way to find a way that could help improve the literacy and writing skills of deaf people. And that included the production of this book. I am not a fan of this book. I dislike it very much. It was disliked because it was a one-to-one translation forced by the government for the sake of writing and literacy of Korean language. There's also a dictionary. There were these 2 dictionaries that were also quite important. It's important to consider dictionaries when you think of language development. So as Korean Sign Language grew and evolved, more dictionaries were printed. The yellow one that you can see was from the deaf school in Seoul. They created it. And then we have the white book on the right. That one was from the Korean Deaf Association. And so those 2 were broadly published, broadly used. But then in 2014, we have a website that was created, right? This is the homepage that was founded for KSL, and it is extensive. If you look at how many Korean words are there, how many words are in that dictionary, you'll find that it's 18,000, is that right? 18,488 words. That is a sizable amount of words. That's an extraordinary amount of words. So you can see the growth, the exponential growth in increasing words that are available in KSL, but that led to protests because deaf citizens felt as if Korean Sign Language was being treated as an equivalent to written Korean and spoken Korean, and they did not want that from the government. They wanted the government to stop viewing it as a word-for-word translation and recognize it as a separate language that does not need to be equivalent. They felt that it wasn't respected, and they felt that the Korean government was not respecting Koreans and how they use things naturally, but instead was trying to just implement this tool to force Korean written language literacy. So that's what was behind the nature of these protests.
In December 2015, as you can see here, there was a National Assembly. And at this assembly, they talked about the use of sign language and how to identify an official language. So there was a vote passed to adopt KSL by law as the official language. And that was a much celebrated event. You can see the history here from 1913 to today, just the number of publications, the number of shared language instances skyrocketed. 1940s, we had Japanese occupation. Beyond that, you will see that the word recognition, the sharing of signs just kept going up and up and up. We have 1982, 5,700, 2005, 9,800. And then in today, 2014 to today, the numbers have just gone up and up, 18,488. Oddly, we're looking at words here. And I don't think this is the right way to approach a language when we're talking about languages. You can't focus on a word-to-word translation. That's not how it works. This is what the government chose as a way to count and focus. But 18,488 is huge. It may be in the future that we get away from this word-to-word type of count and focus more on the translation. When we're talking about sign language translation to a spoken language, it's not a word-to-word equivalent. In 2018 to 2022, the government is planning on teaching KSL more broadly, but the curriculum has not been quite developed yet. There's no curriculum in place. And here's just further points in relation to government-centered work. In South Korea, education, KSL has a history of using oralism, using spoken language to teach deaf students. And that was prominent in 1962. And oralism means they're teaching them through speech, not through signs. Using mouthing, movements of the mouth. And deaf students watch that and try and take in language. It's a fairly difficult process, but it's still utilized in parts of the world today. I'm showing two examples here, but there are many. Signing schools. We have the Seoul Deaf School in 1913, Samsung Deaf School, 1957, the Daegu Deaf School, that was 1946, and the Busan Bawa School, residential school, 1953, and there are many more. Currently, there are various residential schools across the country, about 18 nationwide. And they are oral focused. There is some signing going on at those schools, but 18 in total. For KSL, there are many issues that I'd like to point out. It is a fairly hearing-dominated field of research. There are papers written, but those are moderated and controlled by hearing individuals. There's not very many deaf researchers. Myself, as a researcher, I find that some of the conclusions are not satisfactory. For example, They don't identify facial expressions as part of the grammar, and they are definitely part of the grammar of the language there. But hearing people don't pick up on that. They notice more formalized language, use of sign, but they don't recognize facial expressions as a parameter of the language and often call it low functioning, and that's not true. That's simply not an adequate description of KSL. It incorporates facial expression as part of the grammar of the language. And I don't see that adequately explained in research documentation that's currently available. So that is one issue. For deaf education, the use of KSL is slowly decreasing. What's happening is parents want to be able to communicate with their students or their children, so they'd rather they learn how to speak. So we're seeing numbers plummet with deaf children in South Korea. Many of them don't know how to sign. They've grown up learning oral methods and oral ways of communicating. They may have cochlear implants. Most of the deaf students at birth, they meet in the hospital first and they are given a cochlear implant before they've even had a chance to acquire language. So, and this is a sign that's used often for that. And they'll grow up learning oral ways of communicating, but not so much sign language. Interpreters, maybe they'll go to a public school and they'll have an interpreter working with the deaf children, but that will be their first exposure to language. So they're learning from hearing models who oftentimes have learned it later in life. They're not native users. So you're just seeing the numbers plummet for KSL. And oral methods are going rapidly upwards. When I meet people to communicate in KSL, I see that they just don't have the grammatical structure in place. People are trying to learn it and continue it. As you can see here, this is a Korean Sign Language example, and it's a word-to-word translation. You can see words below each of the signs. Here's the signs that are being used. Some clarification about the words. So what it says here is the teacher comes. Teacher comes to me. And in spoken language, this is how it would be stated. And what they've done is a word-to-word, a word-to-sign translation, but it's not an adequate depiction of how it would be signed. But this is how students are forced to learn it. Because what they've found is many of the deaf students, their writing skills lag behind. So in order to teach them writing skills, they have forced oral teaching, thinking that that will help them improve their writing skills. Glossing is something that we talk about in ASL. It's a way of labeling various signs to retain that information about the language. But using glossing is not an adequate translation of language. It's kind of a shorthand. So they'll have one sign, for instance, this sign, moving away, but they'll have the mouthing movements or gesture with this sign, meaning to go. However, it actually means I can go. And the sign is just one sign, as you see here. It's not adequate to explain the concept of I can go. So that information is important and it's lost when we do this glossing method. Here's some other examples listed here. So this sign again, when I raise my eyebrows and use this sign, it's a form of a question. Are you going? So you're asking a question by adding this eyebrow movement, this facial expression along with the sign. So you can't just do a one-to-one gloss translation. And Lance is saying it's not native. And Dr. Hwang is agreeing. I have several examples here I can share with you.
So, glossing in Korean. There is not a lot of information available. There's not a lot of resources available. I will share with you what I have, but there is room for misunderstanding. So I will do my best to clarify. Here we have a bracket on the left. Inside goes the written word, and you can see the sign here. And then there's also a bracket that has the plus sign between a couple written words. This is compound, meaning there's two different signs together to create one concept or one word. So that's one way to gloss that information. So foreign country, a compound of different and country together to make the word foreign. Because there is no one specific sign for the concept of foreign. So the compound sign that creates one Korean word. So there is a way to express the idea of there being difference, and so that's how you come up with the sign for foreign is different country, and so that is how that is glossed. It's with that plus sign. Now there's a minus sign in the brackets. That means that that is expressing something. For example, this sign right here I'm showing you. This is one word or one expression, one movement. But what it means is that there is no perfect equivalent into Korean. You can see how it's written down here, confirm with the eyes. So that minus is shown to indicate that there is a greater description required than one word to convey the meaning of that word. Now, if you see the pluses after the brackets, that shows that a sign gets repeated. For example, towns, say there are many towns or there are many houses in the town, you would express plurality. So that's what those multiple plus signs are. Here we have the hash symbol or the pound sign. That means that there's no particular sign at all. So there are brackets and then the hash sign. So Seoul has a sign, but Guro has no sign. So when you need to gloss, you need to write down and discuss the sign. This indicates that it needs to be fingerspelled because there is no such sign. So it's brackets and then inside is written Guro and then the hash symbol. Here, with the parentheses inside the brackets, shows the non-manual signals, the facial expression that goes along with it. So there is the sign, but again, importantly, that facial expression can make a huge difference in modifying the meaning of the sign. And the ways that they can be modified are numerous, as you can see from this chart. And these are just some ideas on how that might be. This is not formally accepted yet by the government, but this is some ideas on how that could be conveyed. Here is a sign in Korean where we talk about the leg, right? American Sign Language, we just spell leg, right? L-E-G. Korean Sign Language, you might point at your leg. But you also might need to clarify. So that's when you show this depiction of a person and point to the leg that you are creating with your finger. So if we need a way to gloss, a way to write down and convey that that is how the signer is conveying that idea using that particular strategy, that's the example I have right here with the parentheses and then the brackets on the outside. Keep in mind, you can't just sign one-handed. You would create the legs use your other hand, your non-dominant hand, to then gesture or indicate what it is, right? Or is it just the leg? Is it walking? What's happening? So that clarifying information, we need a way to write it down. We need a way to then convey it in a written form. So these are ideas on how you might do that. Here's another sign that shows learning. Right, American Sign Language, that's the sign for learn. Korean Sign Language, it comes into the eye, repeatedly. So that back and forth motion, that leaning left to right into the eye, that way of signing, how can we show that? How can we depict that with written language? That a person is learning and they're learning various topics. We can't just convey that with one single word, which is what has historically been tried to push, is one word and one meaning. And that's just, this is not possible. That's why we have to have parentheses. We have to be able to expand upon the rich meaning of signs that are being used. You know, and there is a lot of history that shows that language happening. You cannot convey language simply with one thing. This particular sign shows someone learning multiple things. So there's rich information there that cannot be conveyed with a one-to-one equivalence. That's why I'm advocating for the use of this example. There's 3 words that are used to describe the meaning. This is a different written system. It looks far more unknown, a little more alien, maybe more intimidating. So say you have a Korean dictionary. This is another idea on how you may be able to convey with writing. Keep in mind, I don't particularly care for some of the systems currently in sign language dictionaries. Often the people that create them do it in a way that puts the written language ahead of the signed language. And I'd like to be able to place it in a way that raises up the sign language versus the written language. And you can see that depicted here. You might be wondering how to understand and how to interpret that notation. So I'll give you a little bit of history. This comes from a linguist, Stokey. And this is how Americans sign Stokey, right? Yes, okay. So William Stokey did research and created notation that has been incredibly valuable for sign language research. So having taken his idea, his notation for signed language, American Sign Language, and trying to find a way to make it work with Korean and Korean spoken language. Keep in mind that there's spoken language and then there's Korean Sign Language. So if we compare different strategies, different ways to describe sign language, I'd like us to consider Stokey's style as well. So his methodology included a map similar to this that would show you different locations, right? We have the face, we have the symbol right here, we have under the chin, we have at the chin, we have the nose, the ear, the throat area, the chest area and the body, the upper arm, the lower arm. And you see the A, and then you see another A that's upside down. So you can see either direction for that. So this notation was revolutionary. Now a little bit about Korean spoken language. If you are unfamiliar, you can see here, it's the written system is not like we use in America. The actual written style is based on the shapes of the mouth that are made when pronouncing those specific sounds, at least with the consonants. You can see where the tongue is located in these images, right? For the Nian, the N sound, the M sound, the Miem, right? You can see what our mouth does, what your teeth do, S, and then N, that Ng sound happens in the throat, right? So that's why that's shaped the way that it is in Hangul. And so they've added and created the system of consonants. Then if you want to look at vowels in written Korean, we have the sky, we have the ground, then we have man or people. And so it's easy to see the different features to understand and to see how the written component of Korean came about. You compare that with Korean Sign Language. How can we implement those? Going back to Stokes' notation, here's his formula. Requires T, D, S. That's the tab, the des, and the sig. I will add a little bit more to that later so you'll understand. But the location is indicated by the T. The D is the hand shape that is used at the time. And the S, the sig, is the movement. And there's a particular order this must happen in. So this is the formula, and this is how it must be written in. So we showed this, shows the location. 5 is the hand shape being used. This shows orientation, so the direction the hand is facing. And then the X indicates movement. So all of this sign creates the American Sign Language mother. And then you can also, the one on the right shows father. Same sign, different location. This one. So this is hand shape. Looks like that, goes down, moves to the side. That is the sign, means thing. Now we turn our hand over and use a different palm orientation. There's a different meaning there, children. So you change one small component, you can see in the notation looks almost the same except for one small component. The entire meaning is different. Thing versus children. Or things versus children. So here we have spoken language. If we want to look at it in a spoken language phenom, for example, phoneme, spoken language phoneme, right? We've got of a single word. So say we'll analyze a single word. It has various components, could have 3 components, could have 4, just depends, could have a certain number of components to it. If you look at the sign language equivalent, right, it will have those 3, like the T, the D, and the S. However, it could have more. Just like the spoken language words may have more to them. Same for sign language. And for that, it's the sharing. And again, this comes from Stokes, his work. So we'll show you a spoken language example, cat. If you move any of the components of the letters cat, it will no longer be cat. It's important that they're all there in the exact place that they go, in the exact way that they are. If you change one, it's no longer cat. So now we look at the sign language. We've got a location, we've got the hand shape, and we've got the movement, cat. Right, so it's in the nose area, the F hand shape, and it moves outward. And that little dot means that it's repeated. Okay, so that's the sign for cat. And again, this all comes from Stokes' research. Fantastic. So I'd like to be able to do the same thing with Korean. Say we have a Korean word, mul, right? M-U-L, mul, right? We have that Korean word. Now we want to look at the Korean sign. So that is the hand shape, the location, and the movement together. Same word or same concept conveyed differently, spoken language versus sign language. So linguistically, you can see how they are comparable. You can see the idea linguistically for in sign language, the sharing being very similar to the spoken language phoneme. Okay, so here are some pictures that show the different ways to convey the different shapes. You can see here ways to write and notate them. Again, more analysis will happen later, but that is one possible system. So this writing system was actually created by me. It's part of my PhD. So this was part of my thesis, which you can see was titled Understanding Deaf Mission and a Study on the Possibility of Bible Translation in Korean Sign Writing through Sign Language Structure. Now here's a quick example what using Korean Sign Language. So we've got located the nose, the pointer finger pointing, so that's showing the direction, and we've got the movement. Palm orientation shows it's facing toward myself. That's that small yellow triangle. Kettle. Right, so say you have a kettle, you're pouring water out. That imitates the movement of one using a kettle. That's the Korean Sign Language sign for kettle. We've got another one. Here's brother. So it's located on the head, moves inward. Oh, bother. Sorry, interpreter. Clarification, bother, not brother. Or true, or really. And you can see that's located there, small. That's the sign, something small. And right. Like correct, right. So this is one way to notate that Korean signs. Now, keep in mind, this hasn't been implemented today. This is my idea for the future. We're looking forward, maybe 10 years. But it is an area of research that is of high value. And you can see that there's many examples. This particular one, right? We've got this symbol here and this small one right here shows that one component, one hand is moving, the other one stops and is stationary. This is the fixed hand, the left hand. This little eye looking symbol shows that something's happening above in space, showing what's going on with the right hand. We've got a horizontal plane, so that is used to convey the horizontal plane right here. So this symbol indicates a touch and that it's continuously touching, it's not being removed. This is love. To love, express kindness. And then we do it, you can do it like that to modify it. That means it's a little more forceful. Oh, it becomes suppress. If you push it down, that's forceful. You know, if you push it, it's very similar. Stress. And then kind. Different ways to modify. This one is kind. So that this time is from the side and moves. So slight modifications can change the meaning. And again, Korean language had been developing until the time of Japanese occupation. Then it was kind of placed into standby, and it has not quite developed as much as we'd like it to today because of efforts to keep it in line with written and spoken Korean language, which it should not be. In the future, they should create a curriculum that will teach deaf children a natural and idiomatic way to use the language. And I would like to see that happen so that Korean Sign Language can grow and usage can improve, but it hasn't happened yet. Discussions are still going on with that. How to create that curriculum and who's involved is incredibly important. So that's a goal looking for the future. And that's